Nolan Creel's hands gripped the controls of his ship as the desert planet of Aloria loomed closer in the distance. He was supposed to be making the smooth landing, impressing the Krull people, and negotiating the treaty that would hopefully bring peace to the galaxy. But as the ship shuddered and a warning light flashed on his console, Nolan realized that things were not going as planned. His ship was plummeting toward the planet's surface, and the harsh winds of Aloria's legendary sandstorms made it nearly impossible to steer. The ship's engines screamed as they cut out, leaving Nolan with only seconds to act. His mind raced. Come on, Nolan muttered to himself, desperately tapping on the controls. His green eyes flicked to the console, trying to make sense of the array of flashing red lights. His dark hair, a little messy from the stress, brushed against his forehead as he worked quickly. His shirt clung to his lean body as beads of sweat formed on his brow. If he didn't do something, they'd crash, and the mission would be over before it even started. Beside him, Ceres Valka, his Krull guide, sat silently. She was a striking figure, even in the face of disaster. Her strong bronzed arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her amber eyes watched Nolan with a mix of curiosity and impatience. Her black hair, long and intricately braided, swayed slightly with the turbulence. She was a warrior, trained to fight and endure hardships, but even she couldn't hide the tension in her posture. The sandstorm outside raged against the ship's hull, creating an eerie howling sound that made the small vessel tremble. "Are you going to crash us on purpose, human?" Ceres asked coolly, her voice steady, but with a hint of annoyance. Nolan shot her a glance, unable to mask his frustration. "I'm trying my best, you know. You think I want to crash and ruin everything? The peace treaty, my career." Ceres raised an eyebrow, clearly not impressed. "It seems that all humans do is crash. I wonder if your kind is made of stronger stuff or just more stubborn." "Well, we certainly don't give up easily," Nolan said, trying to focus on the controls again. His mouth curled into a half-smile, but his hands were trembling. He wasn't used to the sheer powerlessness of the situation. Normally, he could talk his way out of anything, but today, there was no way to talk his ship out of a crash. Outside, the storm grew fiercer. The visibility was reduced to almost nothing as walls of sand whipped by. Nolan tightened his grip on the controls, determined to keep them both alive. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, followed by a violent jolt that sent the ship tilting wildly. Nolan gasped as his stomach lurched. They were spiraling now, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His heart pounded in his chest. Beside him, Ceres was as calm as ever, her fierce eyes never leaving him. "I hope you're ready for a rough landing," Ceres said, her voice even colder now. "I'd suggest you brace yourself." Nolan blinked in disbelief, not sure if she was teasing or serious. "Bracing? Yeah, that's... Wait, you mean?" Before he could finish his thought, the ship slammed into the sands with a deafening crash. The world seemed to tilt upside down for a moment before everything went still. Nolan's body was thrown forward, and he braced himself against the console, groaning in pain as the momentum sent him slamming into the dashboard. For a few moments, there was silence. The ship was still intact, somewhat, but the damage was clear. Nolan's heart raced, and he let out a shaky breath, looking over at Ceres. She was already unbuckling her seatbelt, seemingly unbothered by the crash. "You all right?" he asked, rubbing his head. Ceres stood, her warrior instincts taking over. She seemed completely unfazed. "I'm fine," she said curtly, already heading for the door. "Now we have to find shelter before the sandstorm destroys what's left of this wreck." Nolan groaned, rubbing his aching shoulder as he stood up. "Great. Stuck on a hostile desert world with a Krull warrior who thinks I'm the worst pilot in the galaxy. Fantastic." Ceres shot him a look over her shoulder, her amber eyes glinting with something between amusement and annoyance. "You're lucky to be alive, human. Now, let's go. We're not here for a vacation." Nolan shook his head, managing a half-laugh despite the circumstances. He had no idea what he was getting into, but one thing was for sure. He was in way over his head. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the vast desert landscape. Nolan and Saris had been walking for hours, the sandstorm finally subsiding but leaving them with little choice but to trudge through the harsh, unforgiving terrain. Nolan was covered in dust from head to toe, his green eyes squinting against the glare of the setting sun. His dark hair was wild and unkempt, and his clothes were torn in places from the crash. Beside him, Saris moved with the grace of a predator, her strong, bronzed legs carrying her effortlessly across the dunes. Her long black hair was now tied back in a simple braid, and her amber eyes scanned the horizon constantly, always alert. "How much farther?" Nolan asked, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "I'm about to collapse." Saris didn't look at him, her face a picture of calm determination. "We will reach the clan's fortress soon," she replied. "But if you cannot keep up, you will be left behind." Nolan groaned but pushed on. He had no choice. He needed to stay in her good graces if he wanted to survive here. The Krall were a tough, proud warrior race, and Saris was one of their fiercest fighters. He had already managed to offend her with his careless comment about their customs, but he was determined to prove himself. It wasn't just for the peace treaty anymore. It was about surviving this strange, hostile world. As they approached a large rock formation, Saris stopped abruptly. Nolan nearly bumped into her, but he quickly caught himself. She was staring at a group of Krall warriors standing in the shadows of the rocks, their towering figures outlined against the twilight sky. They wore ceremonial armor, decorated with intricate tattoos that told stories of battles long past. Their eyes were cold, watching the newcomers with the silent judgment of a people who valued strength above all else. One of the warriors stepped forward. His name was Corin Drax, and he was the leader of this clan. His muscular body was covered in dark tattoos that made him look even more intimidating. His eyes locked onto Nolan with a sharp, assessing gaze. "So this is the human you speak of?" he asked, his voice deep and menacing. "The one who claims to represent Earth?" Nolan straightened his posture, trying to project confidence despite the wave of fear that ran through him. He had heard rumors about Corin, and none of them were good. This was a man who had fought in hundreds of battles and defeated opponents far stronger than him. "Yes," Nolan replied, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "I'm here to discuss the peace treaty between your people and Earth." "Enough." Corin cut him off, his voice booming. "You are a weak human, and your words mean nothing to me." He turned to Saris, his expression softening slightly. "I see you have brought this man to our land. Why?" Saris remained silent for a long moment, her amber eyes narrowing. She was clearly torn between her duty to her people and the strange bond she felt growing between her and Nolan. Finally, she spoke, her voice firm. "He is not just a human," she said. "He is an ally, and he will help us. You will respect him." Corin's lip curled into a sneer. "Respect must be earned. Saris, your human friend has done nothing to prove himself." He stepped closer to Nolan, towering over him. "And if you do not prove yourself, I will show you what happens to those who fail in our land." Nolan's heart raced, and he took a small step back, trying to hide his nervousness. He had no idea what Corin meant by prove himself, but he had a feeling it wasn't going to be easy. Saris, noticing his hesitation, turned to him, her eyes fierce. "You've been in worse situations, human," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "You'll figure it out." Nolan swallowed, gathering his courage. He had no choice but to face whatever challenge lay ahead. He had to prove that he was more than just a diplomat, more than just a man who talked his way out of danger. If he couldn't earn the respect of these Krall warriors, then everything would fall apart. Corin's eyes gleamed with amusement as he raised an eyebrow. "Let's see if your human ingenuity can save you," he said. "We will see if you are worthy of joining us." Saris stepped back, her posture rigid as she watched Nolan. She knew what was coming, and she didn't look happy about it. Nolan, however, didn't have time to dwell on her expression. He had to act quickly. His mind raced, searching for a solution, anything that would get him out of this alive. But whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Nolan was going to have to earn every ounce of respect from these warriors. And if he couldn't, he might never leave Eloria alive. The sun had long since set over the barren landscape of Eloria, casting an eerie glow on the jagged rock formations that dotted the horizon. Nolan and Ceres had arrived at the Krawl fortress just as the night fell, greeted by the warm flickering light of torches. It was a grand structure built into the side of a mountain, its walls decorated with the marks of battle, every scar and scratch telling a story of past conquests. The Krawl warriors walked the grounds with an air of pride, each one tall and muscular, their faces hard and unyielding. Nolan felt small next to them, his green eyes wide with awe and discomfort. His clothes, still dusty from the crash, seemed out of place among the Krawl's ceremonial armor. Ceres, however, was at home. Her long black hair, now tied back in a practical braid, gleamed under the torchlight, and her amber eyes sparkled with a quiet confidence as she led Nolan into the fortress. "Stay close," Ceres instructed, her voice low and commanding. "The Krawl do not take kindly to weakness." Nolan nodded, trying to keep pace. His shoes kicked up small clouds of dust with every step as he glanced around nervously. It wasn't just the fortress that was intimidating. Ceres herself had become a force he didn't fully understand. Her pride, her warrior spirit, all of it made her seem unreachable. He had a lot to learn if he wanted to survive here. They passed through an archway and into a large courtyard, where several Krawl warriors were gathered around a roaring fire. Their deep voices rumbled in the night air as they spoke in their native tongue. Nolan tried to make sense of the conversation, but he was quickly lost in the strange cadence of their language. "Your clan seems proud," Nolan said, attempting to break the silence. "I can see why they follow you." Ceres glanced at him from the corner of her eye. "Pride is the foundation of the Krawl," she said. "Without it, we are nothing." Before Nolan could respond, one of the warriors approached them. It was Corin Drax, the leader of the clan. His massive frame cast a shadow over them, and his tattooed face wore a scowl that made Nolan take an involuntary step back. "Ceres," Corin said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I see the human has made it this far, but he has much to prove if he wants to stay." Nolan didn't like the way Corin was looking at him. It wasn't just the warrior's gaze. It was the way he spoke, like Nolan was some sort of test he had to pass. He straightened up and met Corin's eyes, trying to show that he wasn't afraid. "I've never backed down from a challenge," Nolan said, his voice steady. "I'll prove I'm more than just some diplomat." Corin raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" He turned to Ceres. "You have put your faith in this human. I hope it is not misplaced." Ceres didn't answer immediately. Her gaze softened for a brief moment, as if she were thinking about something beyond the immediate challenge. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter, but still firm. "I believe in him," she said. "Now, let him prove it." Corin didn't seem convinced, but he nodded and motioned for them to follow. They walked to a large stone platform in the center of the courtyard, where a circle of Krawl warriors had gathered. It looked like they were preparing for some sort of test. "You will fight," Corin announced, his voice booming. "To earn your place here, you must prove your worth. A Krawl fight is a battle of strength, skill, and honor. Fail, and you will leave with nothing." Nolan felt his heart race in his chest. He wasn't a fighter, not in the way the Krawl were. He had never faced anything like this before. His mind scrambled for a solution, for anything that could get him through this. Ceres looked at him then, her expression unreadable. "Do not worry," she said softly. "You will not face them all at once. But you must fight with honor, or you will not survive." The first warrior stepped forward, a tall Krawl with broad shoulders and a menacing scowl. He was wearing a set of armored gloves that gleamed in the torchlight, his muscles bulging as he cracked his knuckles. "Are you ready, human?" the warrior growled, his voice thick with challenge. Nolan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wasn't used to physical combat, but he had to make it through. This wasn't just about winning. It was about survival. And if he failed here, Ceres's trust in him might shatter, and the mission would be over. "I'm ready," Nolan said, trying to steady his breath. He stepped into the circle, his heart pounding in his chest. The crowd of Krull warriors fell silent, waiting for the first move. Ceres's amber eyes were fixed on him, watching closely. Nolan took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. The circle of Krull warriors closed around Nolan, their eyes fixed on him with a mix of curiosity and judgment. He could feel the weight of their gaze pressing down on him, the pressure to succeed building with every passing second. He wasn't a fighter. He never had been. His strength lay in his mind, in his ability to talk, to negotiate, to outwit. But here, on the sands of Eloria, none of that mattered. Across from him stood his first opponent, a Krull warrior named Therak. He was massive, with thick arms and a broad chest that made Nolan feel like a twig in comparison. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Nolan as he cracked his knuckles, eager to make quick work of the human who dared challenge him. "You will not last long," Therak growled, his voice deep and heavy, like rolling thunder. "Prepare yourself." Nolan's heart pounded in his chest as he squared his shoulders. His palms were sweaty, and his breath came faster than he would have liked. He wasn't a fighter, but he had to try. If he failed here, everything he and Ceres had worked for, the treaty, their alliance, would fall apart. The sound of the Krull warriors' murmurs filled the air as the challenge began. Therak lunged forward, his speed surprising for someone so large. Nolan barely had time to react as Therak's fist swung toward his face. Without thinking, he ducked, just in time to feel the rush of air from the warrior's missed punch. Nolan stumbled, but he didn't fall. He quickly regained his footing, trying to ignore the growing panic in his chest. His mind raced. He had to think. He couldn't rely on strength, but maybe he could rely on agility. He darted to the side as Therak swung again, the blow barely grazing his arm. The crowd of Krull warriors cheered, their voices a mix of excitement and amusement at Nolan's struggle. "You're quick, human," Therak said, his voice mocking. "But that won't save you." Nolan's muscles burned from the effort of dodging, but he didn't back down. He wasn't going to give up. Not yet. Therak lunged again, this time aiming for Nolan's midsection. Nolan instinctively stepped back, but the warrior's fist caught him in the ribs, sending a shock of pain through his body. He gasped, stumbling back, but he didn't fall. He couldn't. "Enough," a voice shouted from the crowd. It was Ceres, her fierce amber eyes locked on him, her face a mixture of concern and approval. "Fight with honor, Nolan." Nolan took a shaky breath, trying to ignore the pain in his side. Honor. He had to fight with honor. But what did that mean for him? The Krull were warriors, their strength their greatest asset. For him, it wasn't about power. It was about survival. He had to outsmart them, just like he always did. He watched Therak carefully, noting the way the warrior's massive frame moved. Therak was fast for his size, but he relied on brute force. He didn't anticipate quick, precise movements. That was Nolan's advantage. As Therak charged again, Nolan sidestepped and grabbed the warrior's arm, twisting it behind his back in a move he had seen in a self-defense video once. Therak let out a surprised grunt, struggling to break free, but Nolan held firm, using his smaller size to his advantage. With a quick shove, he forced the larger warrior to the ground. The crowd fell silent. Nolan stood over Therak, panting heavily, his chest heaving with exertion. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he had done it. He had taken down a Krull warrior, not through strength, but through strategy and quick thinking. He wasn't a fighter, but he had proven that he could hold his own. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a murmur of approval rippled through the Krull warriors, followed by a slow clap. Corin Drax stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with something close to respect. "You have earned my attention, human," Corin said, his voice deep and measured. "Your strength lies not in your muscles, but in your mind. That is something the Krull respect." Cirrus, standing at the edge of the circle, smiled slightly, her amber eyes glowing with a mixture of pride and something deeper that Nolan couldn't quite place. "You did well," she said quietly, her voice soft but full of meaning. "You fought with honor." Nolan looked back down at Therak, who was now slowly rising to his feet, his expression unreadable. The warrior didn't seem angry. Instead, there was a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "You are not like the others," Therak said, his tone grudging but respectful. "Perhaps you are worthy of this alliance after all." Nolan nodded, still trying to catch his breath. He had done it. He had survived. And in the process, he had gained something he hadn't expected: respect from the Krull. And maybe, just maybe, a small piece of Cirrus's trust. But this was only the beginning. There were many challenges ahead, and Nolan knew that his greatest test was yet to come. The days that followed Nolan's victory over Therak felt like a blur. He was still adjusting to the strange world of the Krull, their warrior customs, and their way of life. Every moment seemed to bring a new challenge, from learning the complex rituals of their tribe to navigating the intricate politics that governed their people. The Krull valued strength, and Nolan knew he would have to prove himself again and again if he wanted to stay here. But the tension that had built between him and Cirrus had not faded. Since the fight with Therak, Cirrus had been distant. She watched him closely, but there was a coldness in her gaze, a hint of doubt that hadn't been there before. Nolan couldn't understand it. He had fought hard to gain their respect, to show that he was more than just a diplomat. But something about the way Cirrus looked at him now made him feel like he hadn't truly earned her trust. It was late in the evening when he finally decided to confront her. The sun had set, and the stars were just beginning to twinkle above the fortress. He found her standing alone near the edge of the courtyard, her back turned to him as she stared out at the distant mountains. Her long black hair flowed in the wind, and her warrior's stance was as strong as ever. Nolan took a deep breath and approached her slowly. "Cirrus," he called, his voice softer than he intended. "We need to talk." Cirrus didn't turn around at first, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "What is it, Nolan?" Her voice was cool, detached. He hesitated, unsure how to approach the subject. "I've noticed that you've been different lately. Since the fight with Therak, you've been distant." There was a long pause before she spoke again, her tone unreadable. "You did well in the fight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but that's not what's bothering me." Nolan's brow furrowed in confusion. "Then what is it?" "I thought I proved myself to the Krull. I thought I proved I could be trusted." Cirrus finally turned to face him, her amber eyes meeting his with a mixture of emotions: concern, confusion, and something deeper that Nolan couldn't quite place. "You don't understand, do you?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's not about the fight. It's not about proving yourself to the Krull. It's about trust." Nolan's heart skipped a beat. "Trust," he repeated, a knot forming in his stomach. "What do you mean?" Cirrus stepped closer to him, her gaze softening slightly. "You can't just fight your way through everything. You think strength is what will make you worthy, but there's more to being part of this world than that. The Krull may value strength, but I—" She paused, her voice faltering. "I need more than that. I need to know I can rely on you, that you'll be there when it matters most." Nolan's mind raced as he processed her words. He had thought that winning battles, earning respect through action, would be enough. But Cirrus was asking for something deeper, something that couldn't be proven through a fight. "I'm not just here to make allies," Cirrus continued, her voice steady. "I'm here because I want to believe in something greater than just fighting. I want to believe in something real." Nolan swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been so focused on surviving, on proving his worth, that he hadn't stopped to think about what Cirrus needed from him. She wasn't just looking for a partner in battle. She was looking for someone she could trust, someone who would stand by her when everything else was falling apart. "I get it," he said, his voice soft with understanding. "You don't need me to just be a warrior. You need me to be there, to trust you and let you trust me." Cirrus nodded slowly, her eyes studying him carefully. "Yes. Trust is the foundation of everything, Nolan. Without it, nothing lasts." Nolan took a step forward, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over him. He reached out, placing his hand gently on her arm. "I promise you, Cirrus," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "I'll prove that you can trust me." Cirrus looked at him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. After a few tense seconds, she finally nodded. "I hope you mean that, Nolan, because if you don't, it will cost us everything." For the first time since they arrived in the Krawl fortress, Nolan felt a weight lift from his chest. Cirrus wasn't just pushing him away. She was testing him, looking for something real. And now, he understood what he had to do. It wasn't enough to prove his strength or his skills. He had to show Cirrus that he was more than just a human diplomat. He had to prove that he was someone she could count on, no matter what. As they stood there, the cool desert wind blowing through the courtyard, Nolan realized that this mission, this partnership, was about more than survival. It was about trust, and he would do whatever it took to earn it. The sun was still hidden behind the distant mountains when Cirrus and Nolan stood on the edge of the Krawl fortress. The air was thick with tension, the silence of the morning broken only by the distant howls of creatures in the desert. The world seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to happen. Nolan glanced at Cirrus, her expression unreadable as she stared out over the edge of the cliff. Her black braid swayed in the wind, and her posture was strong and unyielding. In the harsh light of the early morning, she looked like the very definition of a warrior, a force of nature in her own right. He couldn't help but admire her strength, even as he felt the weight of their unspoken words between them. "Cirrus," he said quietly, stepping closer. "Are you ready for this?" She didn't turn to him immediately, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. For a moment, Nolan thought she might not answer. But then, with a soft exhale, she spoke. "I am always ready," she said, her voice firm, though there was something in her eyes that softened the harshness of her words. "But this is more than just a fight. This is about the future of the Krawl. It's about everything we stand for." Nolan nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. The treaty they were working on was fragile. The Krawl were a proud people, bound by honor and tradition. They would never ally with Earth if they saw it as a sign of weakness. Every step they took now would either bring them closer to peace or pull them further apart. And Nolan knew that the Krawl would never trust him unless he proved himself in a way that went beyond mere words. "Do you think they'll accept it?" Nolan asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "The treaty, I mean. The Krawl have been at war with so many others. Are they ready to change their ways?" Cirrus finally turned to him, her amber eyes locking onto his with a fierce intensity. "The Krawl do not change easily," she said. "We fight for what we believe in, no matter the cost. But if we are to survive, we must adapt. That is the heart of the challenge." Nolan looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. He had seen the strength of the Krawl in their customs, in their warriors, and in the fire that burned in their eyes. But Cirrus was right. To survive, they would need to adapt, to accept change, and to trust in the possibility of peace. It wasn't just about strength. It was about finding common ground. "Then I'll make sure this treaty is worth the risk," Nolan said, determination filling his chest. "I'll do whatever it takes." Cirrus didn't respond right away, but her gaze softened slightly. She seemed to study him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, considering his resolve. Then, without a word, she turned back toward the fortress, her movements steady and purposeful. "Come," she said, her voice no longer a command, but something more. "It is time." They walked together toward the heart of the fortress, where the Kral elders awaited them. Nolan couldn't help but notice the tension in the air as they approached the grand hall. The elders were seated on stone thrones, their eyes watching him with skepticism, their faces lined with years of battle and tradition. It was clear that their decision would not come easily. Corin Drax, the clan leader, sat at the head of the council, his massive form casting a shadow over the room. His eyes were sharp, his expression unreadable. As Cirrus and Nolan entered, the room fell silent. "You stand before us, human," Corin said, his voice like the rumble of thunder. "You have proven yourself in battle, but words alone will not win the trust of the Kral." Nolan nodded, his heart pounding. "I understand, Corin," he said, his voice steady. "But the treaty is not just about trust. It's about the future. It's about what comes after the fighting stops." There was a long pause as the elders exchanged looks, their faces unreadable. The weight of the moment pressed down on Nolan, but he didn't falter. He knew this was his chance to prove himself, not through strength, but through something far more difficult, his ability to lead, to show the Kral that peace was not only possible, but necessary. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Corin spoke again. "You speak of peace, human. But peace is not something that can be given. It must be earned." Cirrus stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We are not asking for peace from weakness," she said, her eyes locking onto Corin's with a fierce fire. "We are asking for peace from strength. The Kral cannot survive if they continue to fight every battle alone." Corin stared at Cirrus for a moment, his gaze calculating. Then, with a slow nod, he turned his eyes back to Nolan. "Perhaps you are right," he said, his tone grudging. "But you will have to prove it. You will have to show us that you can lead, both the humans and the Kral, into a new future." The tension in the room was palpable. Nolan could feel the weight of the Kral elders' gaze on him, each stare sharp and calculating. They were waiting for him to make his move, to prove that he could be the leader they needed. Every word he spoke, every gesture, would be scrutinized. This was no longer about just surviving the challenges or winning one battle. It was about securing a future for both the Kral and humanity. Cirrus stood by his side, her presence a steady anchor. The sharp lines of her face softened slightly as she glanced at him, her amber eyes filled with something Nolan couldn't quite name. She had trusted him to bring this treaty to fruition, and now he had to prove that trust was not misplaced. "Peace," Corin Drax said, his voice low and commanding, "is a dangerous thing for a people like ours. We are warriors, not diplomats. What you ask of us, what you ask of me, is a change in our very soul." Nolan stood tall, meeting Corin's gaze without flinching. "I understand," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "But peace doesn't mean weakness. It means strength, strength to protect what matters, to ensure our people have a future beyond constant fighting." The room was silent for a moment. The other Kral elders exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. The air felt thick with expectation, as if the very foundations of their world were being tested in that single moment. Cirrus took a step forward, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Our people have fought for centuries," she said, her tone strong yet tinged with a hint of weariness. "But if we continue on this path, we will only destroy ourselves. Nolan is right. We need to find a way to survive without constant war." Corin Drax's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Cirrus. "You speak of change, Cirrus, but change is not something easily embraced by the Kral. We value our traditions, our strength. What you propose, this alliance with the humans, it is not a simple thing." Nolan nodded, understanding the weight of Corin's words. "I don't expect this to be easy," he said, "but the world is changing. The Kral can't fight alone forever. Humanity offers a different path, a path where we can fight together, rather than against each other. Another long silence followed. Nolan's palms began to sweat, and he could feel the pressure mounting. He had said everything he needed to say, but he knew the Crawl would not be swayed by words alone. They needed proof. Proof that this alliance was more than just a fleeting hope. Finally, Corin Drax spoke again, his voice filled with gravitas. Your words are strong, human, but they are just that, words. To prove your worth, you must do more than speak. You must show us that this alliance can bring real change. Nolan's heart raced. He had expected this, but the reality of it hit him hard. The Crawl wanted proof. Something tangible to show that this alliance could work. But what could he possibly do to prove it? He wasn't a warrior like Cirrus or Theric. He couldn't fight his way to their hearts. I'm not a fighter, Nolan said, his voice quiet but firm. But I can lead. I can bring people together. And I will show you that peace is worth the risk. I'll do whatever it takes. Corin studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he turned his gaze to Cirrus. And you, Cirrus, he said. Do you believe in this human? Do you trust him enough to place the future of your people in his hands? Cirrus hesitated, her eyes meeting Nolan's. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. Nolan held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had already fought for her trust once, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just about him. It was about both of them, their futures, and the future of the Crawl. Slowly, Cirrus nodded. I trust him, she said, her voice steady. And I believe in what he's trying to do. Finally, Corin Drax stood, his massive frame casting a shadow over the room. Very well, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything. You have earned our respect, human. And Cirrus, you have earned our trust. The treaty will be signed. Nolan exhaled, relief washing over him like a wave. He had done it. The treaty was within their grasp. But even as the Crawl elders began to rise, signaling the end of the meeting, Nolan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult. They had made an agreement, but keeping it would take everything they had. Cirrus looked at him then, her eyes softening. You did it, she said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. You proved them wrong. Nolan smiled back, but his mind was already racing, thinking of the next challenge, the next test. The future of the Crawl and humanity depended on him, and he couldn't afford to fail. The Crawl fortress buzzed with activity. Nolan could feel the difference in the air, the palpable sense of change that had swept through the once quiet halls. The treaty had been signed, and for the first time, the Crawl and humans stood on the edge of something new, a future together. But even with the weight of their success, Nolan knew that the real work was just beginning. Cirrus stood beside him as they walked through the bustling courtyard. The warriors of the Crawl had gathered in preparation for the ceremonial feast to celebrate the alliance. The sounds of laughter, chatter, and the clinking of weapons filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence that had hung over the fortress only days before. It felt as though a new chapter had begun, one that was still being written. You did it, Cirrus said, her voice low but filled with pride. She glanced at him, her amber eyes glowing softly in the dim light. You showed them that peace is possible. Nolan smiled, but there was a weight to his smile. We showed them, he corrected her gently. You and I. This was never just about me. Cirrus stopped walking and turned to face him, her gaze intense. I didn't think it was possible, she admitted. I didn't think the Crawl would ever accept change. But now I see it. The future you spoke of, it's real. The moment felt like a breath between two worlds. Nolan knew that the Crawl had taken a huge risk by agreeing to the treaty. They were a proud, battle-hardened people, and the idea of forging peace with a foreign race was not something easily accepted. But Cirrus had believed in him from the start, even when others had doubted. And now, they had both fought for this future. "I couldn't have done it without you," Nolan said, his voice sincere. "You were the key to all of this. The Krell trust you more than anyone else, and your strength helped convince them to take this step." Cirrus shook her head, a small, almost wistful smile forming on her lips. "It's not just about strength, Nolan. It's about what we can build together. The Krell need more than a warrior. They need someone who can lead them towards something greater, something that doesn't involve endless fighting." Nolan felt a surge of pride at her words. This wasn't just a victory for the humans. It was a victory for Cirrus, for the Krell, and for everyone who had believed that peace was a distant dream. They had made it happen, and they had done it together. As they walked deeper into the courtyard, the sounds of the feast grew louder. The Krell warriors were preparing to celebrate, but Nolan couldn't help but feel that the celebration was only a small part of the larger picture. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. There were still many challenges to face, and the Alliance would need constant care to survive. Cirrus paused, her gaze turning toward the sky. The twin moons of the desert world hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the land. "The future isn't something we can predict," she said quietly. "It's something we create, together." Nolan stood beside her, watching the moons rise higher. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path they had walked, for the trust they had earned, and for the partnership that had formed between them. The road ahead would be difficult, but they would face it together. And as long as they did, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. "You're right," Nolan said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We create it together." Cirrus smiled at him, the warmth in her eyes unmistakable. "Then let's build something worth fighting for." And with that, they turned toward the celebration, ready to take the first steps into this new world they had forged. The Krell were not just warriors. They were now allies. And the humans, once strangers, were now part of their family. The challenges ahead would be great, but for the first time in a long while, Nolan felt that the future was full of hope. The two of them entered the feast together, the weight of their shared responsibility heavy but comforting. As they joined the Krell around the fire, laughter and music filling the night air, Nolan knew that this was just the beginning of something far greater than any battle he had ever fought. It was a beginning built on trust, on unity, and on the belief that, together, they could create a future worth fighting for.